I was sitting at my kitchen table in Phoenix, Arizona, finishing up my morning coffee when I heard footsteps on my roof that definitely were not supposed to be there. The sound of boots scraping across shingles made me freeze mid-sip. I lived alone in this modest two-story house in the Sunrise Ridge community, and nobody had any business being up there without my permission. I rushed outside into the already blazing June heat and shielded my eyes from the sun. What I saw made my blood run cold. A man in cargo pants and a polo shirt with the HO logo was standing on my roof next to my satellite dish, a wrench in his hand. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted up at him. He glanced down at me with barely concealed irritation. "HOA business. This dish is a violation." "Get off my roof right now," I yelled, my voice cracking with anger. Before I could say another word, he twisted the satellite dish with both hands. I heard the grinding of metal and watched in absolute horror as he ripped the entire unit from its mounting. Bolts tore free from the roof with a sickening crack, taking chunks of roofing material with them. The dish tumbled down the slope of the roof and crashed into my front yard, leaving a gaping hole where it had been secured. My name is Daniel Wright, and I had just watched the Sunrise Ridge Homeowners Association vandalize my property in broad daylight. I stood there stunned, my phone already in my hand, as the man climbed down the ladder leaning against my house like he had just completed a routine maintenance task. "You cannot do that. That is illegal destruction of property," I said, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. A woman emerged from an HOA vehicle parked in my driveway. She was probably in her late 40s, with that particular haircut that screamed entitlement, short, angular, with blonde highlights that looked like they cost more than my monthly utilities. Her name tag read Brenda Patterson, HOA President. "Mr. Wright, your satellite dish violated Section 12.4 of our community guidelines. No exterior fixtures are permitted without written approval from the board," she said in that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "I have written approval. I submitted the paperwork 8 months ago when I moved in," I shot back, still holding my phone to my ear as the emergency dispatcher answered. "Yes, I need to report property destruction and trespassing," I said into the phone, never breaking eye contact with Brenda. Her expression shifted from smug satisfaction to genuine surprise. "You are overreacting, Mr. Wright. This is an HOA matter, not a police matter." The dispatcher asked for my address and details. I explained everything while Brenda stood there, her confidence visibly wavering. The man who had destroyed my dish was loading his ladder onto the HOA truck, apparently eager to leave. "Officers are on their way," the dispatcher informed me. I hung up and walked over to examine my destroyed satellite dish. It was completely mangled, the metal twisted and the electronics exposed. The mounting brackets were still partially attached to chunks of my roof that had been torn away. I took photos with my phone from every angle. "You had no right to do this," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "Even if there was a violation, which there is not, you cannot enter private property and destroy personal belongings." Brenda crossed her arms. "Our guidelines clearly state." "Your guidelines do not override federal law," I interrupted. "The FCC has regulations protecting satellite dish installations. You just violated federal communications law." That made her pause. I could see the wheels turning in her head, probably calculating whether I was bluffing. I was not. I had done my research when I first moved to Sunrise Ridge. After years of living in apartments, I had finally bought my own home. I worked as a software engineer remotely, and reliable internet and television were essential. The community had terrible cable service, so I had installed a satellite dish for both internet and TV. I had submitted all the proper paperwork to the HOA, complete with installation plans and FCC documentation showing that I was within my rights as a homeowner. 2 Phoenix Police Department cruisers pulled up to my house within 10 minutes. Officers Martinez and Chen stepped out, and I explained the situation. Brenda immediately launched into her own version, waving a folder of supposed HOA violations. "Madam, did you authorize someone to go onto this man's roof?" Officer Martinez asked, cutting through her explanation. "The HOA has the authority to enforce community standards," Brenda insisted. "That is not what I asked. Did you send someone onto his roof to remove property?" "The satellite dish was in violation. Answer the question, please." Officer Chen interjected. Brenda's jaw tightened. "Yes, we sent our maintenance contractor to remove the unauthorized fixture." Officer Martinez turned to me. "Do you have documentation of your approval request?" "Yes, sir. In my house. I can get it right now." I rushed inside and pulled out my home office filing cabinet. I kept everything meticulously organized, a habit from my years working in tech where documentation was everything. I grabbed the entire HOA folder and brought it outside. Inside were my original application for the satellite dish installation, complete with technical specifications, photos of the proposed installation site, and a letter citing FCC regulations under the over-the-air reception devices rule, which protected my right to install receiving antennas. I also had the certified mail receipt showing that the HOA had received my application 8 months ago. What I did not have was any response from them, either approval or denial. Officer Martinez reviewed the documents carefully. "Ms. Patterson, did your HOA respond to this application?" Brenda snatched the papers from his hand and skimmed them quickly, her face flushed red. "This must have been lost in our administrative transition. We had a new board elected 6 months ago, and some paperwork may not have been properly transferred." "So you never actually denied his application?" Officer Chen asked. "We had no record of it," Brenda said defensively. "But you also never approved it, and he installed the dish anyway," she continued, as if she had found a loophole. I pulled out my phone and opened my email. "Actually, I have emails here showing I contacted the HOA 3 times asking for status updates. I never received a response." Under FCC guidelines, if an HOA does not respond within a reasonable time frame, the homeowner can proceed with installation as long as it meets safety and technical requirements. Officer Martinez looked at Brenda with barely concealed disapproval. "Regardless of HOA procedures, you cannot enter private property and destroy personal belongings. That is criminal mischief at minimum, possibly trespassing and vandalism." "I want to press charges," I said firmly. "They have caused at least $3,000 in damage between the satellite equipment and my roof." Brenda's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. We enforce standards every day. We have removed unauthorized decorations, signs, and fixtures from dozens of properties. This is no different. Those other situations did not involve federal law," Officer Chen pointed out. "Satellite dishes are specifically protected by FCC regulations. Homeowners associations cannot prohibit them, only impose reasonable regulations regarding size, location, and installation safety." The officer turned to me. "Do you want to pursue criminal charges, or would you prefer to handle this as a civil matter?" I thought about it for a moment. Pressing criminal charges would mean police reports, possible arrests, and a lengthy process. But I also wanted to send a message that this kind of abuse of power was unacceptable. "Both," I said. "I want a police report filed, and I will be contacting the FCC and my attorney." Officer Martinez nodded and began filling out paperwork. Brenda looked like she wanted to argue further, but Officer Chen had already separated her and was taking her statement. The maintenance contractor who had physically removed the dish was sitting in the HOA truck, looking increasingly nervous. After the officers finished their reports and left, I stood in my front yard staring at the destroyed satellite dish and the damaged roof. My peaceful Monday morning had turned into a nightmare. I went back inside and did what any reasonable person in 2026 would do. I started making calls. My first call was to my insurance company to report the damage. They opened a claim and scheduled an adjuster to come out the next day. My second call was to my satellite provider to report the equipment destruction. They were horrified and immediately began the process for filing their own claim since they technically owned the dish. My third call was the most important one. I contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. The law office of Patricia Huang had excellent reviews online, particularly for cases involving HOA overreach. Her paralegal scheduled me for a consultation the following morning. Then I made my fourth call, this one to the Federal Communications Commission's Consumer Complaint Center. The FCC representative I spoke with was extremely interested in my case. She explained that violations of the over-the-air reception devices rule were taken very seriously, especially when an HOA physically destroyed protected equipment. She walked me through filing a formal complaint and assured me that an investigator would be assigned to my case. By the time I finished making calls, it was early afternoon. I ordered lunch delivery and sat down to document everything. I wrote out a detailed timeline of events from my initial HOA application to the morning's destruction. I compiled all my photos, emails, and documents into organized folders. Years of project management experience had taught me that thorough documentation was the difference between winning and losing any dispute. That evening, my next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Frank who had lived in Sunrise Ridge for over a decade, knocked on my door. "I saw what happened this morning," he said, shaking his head. "Brenda and her cronies have been out of control since they took over the board. She has fined half the neighborhood for nonsense violations." "Has she destroyed anyone else's property?" I asked. "Not like this. Mostly she just sends threatening letters and imposes fines. But I will tell you, several people have moved out because they could not deal with her anymore. She treats this place like her personal kingdom." Frank agreed to provide a witness statement about what he had observed. I thanked him and added his information to my growing case file. The next morning, the insurance adjuster arrived at 8 sharp. He was a thorough professional who spent over an hour examining the roof damage, photographing everything, and documenting the destroyed satellite equipment. His preliminary estimate put the total damage at $4,500 more than I had initially thought. The roof had sustained water damage to the underlying structure where the mounting bolts had been torn out, requiring more extensive repairs than just replacing shingles. This was deliberate destruction, the adjuster said, shaking his head. I have seen storms rip dishes off roofs and it never looks like this. Someone used tools to forcefully remove this. It was the OA, I confirmed. I have police reports and witness statements. Your insurance will cover the repairs minus your deductible, but we will absolutely be pursuing subrogation against the HOA. They are going to pay for this. My attorney consultation was at 11. Patricia Huang was a sharp woman in her mid-30s who exuded competence. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking notes on her tablet. You have an excellent case, she said when I finished. Multiple violations here: trespass, destruction of property, violation of FCC regulations, and likely breach of contract regarding their own HOA procedures. The fact that you have documented everything so thoroughly puts you in a very strong position. What are my options? I asked. We can pursue several avenues simultaneously. First, we file a lawsuit against the HOA for property damage and associated costs. Second, we file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which regulates HOAs in Arizona. Third, we support your FCC complaint with additional legal documentation. And fourth, we send a formal demand letter requiring them to immediately authorize reinstallation and pay for all damages. Do all of it, I said without hesitation. I want to make sure they never do this to anyone else. Patricia smiled slightly. I was hoping you would say that. Cases like this can set important precedents. HOAs need to understand they are not above the law. We spent another hour going over details and signing representation agreements. Patricia assured me she would have a demand letter ready to send by the end of the week. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated rapidly. The HOA responded to Patricia's demand letter with their own attorney, a nervous-sounding man who seemed to know his clients were in serious trouble. They denied any wrongdoing, claimed they were within their rights to enforce community standards, and refused to pay for damages. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was sending me a formal fine notice for having an unauthorized satellite dish installation, along with a bill for $1,500 in violation fees. I forwarded it directly to Patricia, who called me laughing. They just handed us additional evidence of bad faith, she said. They are fining you for having a dish they destroyed. This is going to be very easy. The FCC investigation moved forward with surprising speed. An investigator named Robert Chen contacted me and arranged to visit my property. He was a meticulous man who spent hours reviewing my documentation, examining the installation site, and photographing everything. He also requested all correspondence with the HOA, which I provided. This is one of the more egregious violations I have seen, he told me. The over-the-air reception devices rule is very clear. HOAs can impose reasonable restrictions on installation safety requirements, location preferences within the property, things like that. But they cannot prohibit installations, require approval processes that take unreasonably long, or physically remove compliant installations. Your dish was properly installed in a standard location, and you followed appropriate notification procedures. What happens now? I asked. I will complete my investigation and submit a report to the Enforcement Bureau. Based on what I have seen, I will be recommending formal enforcement action against the HOA, including fines and a mandatory compliance order requiring them to pay for full reinstallation and compensate you for their violations. The word fines made me perk up. How much are we talking about? FCC fines for willful violations can range significantly depending on severity and the entity's prior violations. For a first offense involving property destruction, likely somewhere between $10,000 and $25,000. But that is just my preliminary assessment. The Enforcement Bureau makes the final determination. I felt a grim satisfaction hearing that. $25,000 would definitely get the HOA's attention. Meanwhile, I had to deal with the practical problems their destruction had caused. Without my satellite internet, my work-from-home situation became difficult. I had to temporarily upgrade my cellular data plan and use my phone as a hotspot, which was expensive and unreliable. I documented every additional expense, knowing I would be seeking reimbursement. About 3 weeks after the incident, I received a notice that there would be an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss recent legal matters. All homeowners were invited to attend. I definitely planned to be there. The meeting was held on a Wednesday evening in the community clubhouse. I arrived early and was surprised to see the room filling up quickly. Apparently word had spread about what happened and other homeowners were interested. I recognized Frank, and several other neighbors came over to express their support. Brenda called the meeting to order with 4 other board members flanking her. She looked significantly less confident than she had in my driveway 3 weeks ago. Their attorney was also present, sitting off to the side with a briefcase full of documents. We have called this meeting to address recent allegations and legal complaints, Brenda began, her voice tight. First, I want to assure everyone that the board always acts in the best interests of the community and in accordance with our governing documents. Even when you violate federal law, someone called out from the audience. A few people chuckled. Brenda's face reddened. We had concerns about an unauthorized installation that we believed violated community standards. We have since learned there may have been some procedural issues with how the matter was handled. Procedural issues? I stood up. You sent someone onto my roof without permission to destroy my legally protected satellite dish. That is not a procedural issue. That is criminal destruction of property and a federal violation. The room erupted in murmurs. Several people turned to look at me with surprise and support. The HOA attorney stood up. Mr. Wright, we understand you have filed complaints and retained counsel. While we believe the HOA acted within its authority, we are willing to discuss a potential resolution to avoid costly litigation. What kind of resolution? I asked. The HOA would agree to permit your satellite dish installation going forward and would contribute a reasonable amount toward repairs. How much? Patricia had advised me not to negotiate without her present, but I wanted to hear what they were offering. We are prepared to offer $1,500, I almost laughed. Your actions caused over $4,500 in direct damage, not counting my legal fees, lost work time, temporary internet costs, and other expenses. The total exceeds $10,000. And that does not even address the FCC investigation, which will likely result in federal fines against the HOA. That got everyone's attention. Homeowners started talking among themselves, clearly concerned. One man stood up. Wait, federal fines? What does that mean for our HOA dues? The attorney looked uncomfortable. Any penalties assessed would need to be covered by HOA funds, which could potentially require a special assessment or increase in dues. Now people were getting angry. A woman in the back shouted, "We are going to have to pay more because the board screwed up? This is ridiculous." Another homeowner stood up. I move for a vote of no confidence in the current board. That is not on the agenda, Brenda snapped. I do not care what is on your agenda. The homeowner shot back. You have exposed this entire community to legal liability because you wanted to play enforcer. I want a new board that actually knows what they are doing. The meeting devolved into chaos. Homeowners were shouting questions and accusations at the board. Brenda tried to maintain order, but she had completely lost control of the room. Eventually, she adjourned the meeting abruptly and the board members fled out a side door. I left the meeting feeling energized. The community was clearly turning against Brenda and her board. Several homeowners stopped me to express their support and share their own stories of HOA overreach under Brenda's leadership. One couple told me they had been fined repeatedly for having their trash cans visible from the street, even though the HOA had no designated storage requirement. Another man said he had been threatened with legal action for painting his front door a shade of blue that was supposedly not on the approved color list, even though he had matched the exact color code from the HOA guidelines. I collected contact information from everyone who was willing to provide a statement about HOA abuse. Patricia had mentioned that showing a pattern of behavior would strengthen our case, and I now had evidence that this was not an isolated incident. The next major development came about 6 weeks after the initial destruction. I received a certified letter from the FCC Enforcement Bureau. Inside was a notice of apparent liability for forfeiture, basically a formal notification that the FCC was fining the Sunrise Ridge HOA for violating federal communications law. The fine was $32,000. I read through the multi-page document with growing satisfaction. The FCC had conducted a thorough investigation and found that the HOA had willfully violated the over-the-air reception devices rule by destroying my compliant satellite installation. The notice detailed each violation and explained why the fine amount was justified. It also included an order requiring the HOA to immediately authorize my satellite dish reinstallation and to cease any policies or practices that violated federal communications regulations. I forwarded a copy to Patricia immediately. She called me within an hour, sounding delighted. "This is even better than I expected," she said. "The FCC does not usually move this quickly or impose fines this high unless the violation is particularly egregious. The fact that they included a mandatory compliance order is huge. The HOA now has no choice but to authorize your installation and pay for everything." "What about my lawsuit?" I asked. "We keep moving forward. The FCC fine is separate from your property damage claim. They still owe you for the repairs, your expenses, and your legal fees. But now we have federal enforcement backing us up. I expect their attorney will be calling me very soon to discuss settlement." She was right. The next day, Patricia called to tell me the HOA's attorney had requested an urgent meeting to discuss resolution. We scheduled it for that Friday. The meeting took place in Patricia's conference room. Brenda attended along with 2 other board members and their attorney, a different lawyer than the one who had been at the community meeting. Apparently, they had upgraded their legal representation. "Let me be direct," their new attorney began. He was an older man with gray hair and an expensive suit. The board made serious errors in judgment regarding Mr. Wright's satellite dish. They acted on bad advice from their former counsel and without properly understanding the applicable federal regulations. The HOA is prepared to make this situation right. I am listening, Patricia said coolly. We are prepared to offer full compensation for all documented damages and expenses, including roof repairs, satellite equipment replacement, temporary internet costs, and reasonable attorney fees. We will also issue a formal apology and guarantee that Mr. Wright will face no further interference with his satellite installation. What is the total offer? Patricia asked. The attorney slid a document across the table. $14,500 to cover all documented damages and expenses to date. We will also pay for reinstallation of a new satellite dish and system, with installation costs covered separately by the HOA. Patricia and I had discussed my bottom line before the meeting. The number they were offering was close to what we had calculated as my total damages. But there were other considerations. What about the FCC fine? I asked. That is a separate matter between the HOA and the federal government, their attorney said carefully. A separate matter that will be paid with funds from homeowner dues, correct? I pressed. Brenda shifted uncomfortably but did not answer. Here is my concern, I said. You are offering to make me whole, which is appropriate, but I want to ensure this never happens to anyone else in the community. What changes is the HOA making to prevent future violations? Their attorney looked at Brenda, who reluctantly spoke up. The board has agreed to revise our approval processes and provide training on federal regulations regarding protected installations. Not good enough, I said. I want specific policy changes documented. Any homeowner requesting installation of a satellite dish or antenna should receive written acknowledgement within 7 days and a final decision within 30 days. If the HOA fails to respond within 30 days, the installation is deemed approved. All denials must include specific reasons based on legitimate safety concerns, not aesthetic preferences, and any board member who violates these policies faces immediate removal. The board members looked at each other nervously. Their attorney made notes. Those are reasonable requirements, Patricia added. My client is not trying to prevent the HOA from functioning. He is simply ensuring that proper procedures are in place and that homeowners' federal rights are protected. After some back and forth, we reached an agreement. The HOA would pay $15,000 in total compensation, cover all reinstallation costs, implement the policy changes I had outlined, and issue a community-wide notice educating homeowners about their rights regarding satellite dishes and antennas. In exchange, I would dismiss my lawsuit against the HOA, though the FCC enforcement action would continue independently. We signed the settlement agreement that afternoon. Patricia had insisted on including a clause that if the HOA failed to comply with any term of the agreement, the entire settlement would be void and my lawsuit would be reinstated with prejudicial terms. They had agreed, probably because they had no other choice. The check arrived within 2 weeks. I deposited it and immediately contacted my satellite provider to schedule reinstallation. The technician who came out was the same one who had done my original installation almost a year earlier. I heard what happened, he said as he unpacked new equipment. Word gets around in our industry. The company was pretty upset when they found out an HOA had destroyed their equipment. They are filing their own complaint with the FCC too. Good, I said. The more pressure on them, the better. The reinstallation took about 3 hours. The technician had to repair the roof mounting points before installing the new dish. He took extra care to ensure everything was secure and properly sealed. When he finished, he handed me a detailed installation report documenting that everything met or exceeded industry standards and FCC requirements. If anyone gives you trouble about this again, you call the company directly, he said. We will deal with it. My satellite service was back up and running that evening. After months of dealing with spotty cellular hotspot connections, having reliable high-speed internet again felt like a luxury, but the story was not over yet. The HOA still had to deal with the FCC fine. About 3 months after the settlement, Frank knocked on my door again. He handed me a notice that had just been delivered to all homeowners. You need to read this, he said with a grim expression. The notice informed residents that the Sunrise Ridge HOA had been fined by the Federal Communications Commission for violations of federal regulations. It explained that the fine of $32,000 had to be paid from HOA reserves, which had depleted the emergency fund below the legally required minimum. Therefore, the board was imposing a special assessment of $400 per household to replenish the reserves. $400 because Brenda decided to be a tyrant, Frank said angrily. Half the neighborhood is furious. There is going to be another meeting, and people are calling for the entire board to resign. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and this time it was even more packed than the last one. Homeowners filled every seat and lined the walls. The anger in the room was palpable. Brenda tried to open the meeting, but she was immediately shouted down. "Resign! You cost us all money because of your power trip. We demand a new board." Eventually, the HOA attorney managed to restore some order. He explained that under Arizona law, the board could impose reasonable special assessments to cover necessary expenses, and that the FCC fine constituted such an expense. "It may be legal, but it is not right," someone shouted. "Why should we pay for their mistakes?" A homeowner stood up with a printed document. "I have here a petition signed by 63% of homeowners in this community, calling for the immediate resignation of the current board and the scheduling of emergency elections. Under our HOA bylaws, a petition with signatures from more than 50% of homeowners requires the board to act." Brenda looked stricken. The other board members were whispering urgently among themselves. Their attorney examined the petition and confirmed that it appeared to meet the requirements. "Very well," Brenda said stiffly. "The board will schedule emergency elections within 30 days as required by the bylaws. And we expect all current board members to step down immediately," another homeowner added. "We have no confidence in your ability to lead this community." One by one, the board members announced they would not be seeking re-election. Brenda was the last to speak, and she could barely contain her bitterness. "I have dedicated countless hours to this community, trying to maintain standards and property values," she said, her voice shaking. "If this is the thanks I get, then so be it. I resign immediately." The room erupted in applause. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. Brenda had brought this on herself through arrogance and overreach, but there was something sad about watching someone's little empire crumble. A new interim board was appointed that evening from volunteers in the community. Frank agreed to serve temporarily, along with 4 others who had been vocal about reform. Their first action was to formally adopt the policy changes regarding satellite dishes and antennas that I had negotiated in my settlement. Their second action was to launch an audit of HOA finances and decision-making under the previous board. That audit revealed some interesting information. Over the previous year, Brenda's board had issued over $40,000 in fines to homeowners for various violations, most of them questionable. Several of those homeowners had simply paid the fines rather than fight them, not knowing they had options. The interim board reached out to those homeowners and offered to review their cases. It also came out that Brenda had awarded several maintenance contracts to companies owned by her relatives without proper competitive bidding. While not technically illegal, it was a clear conflict of interest that raised questions about how HOA funds had been managed. The permanent elections were held 6 weeks later. A completely new board was elected, composed of homeowners who had been vocal about reform and transparency. Frank won a seat, which made me happy. He was a reasonable man who actually cared about the community rather than petty power games. The new board's first major action was to revamp the HOA's entire approach to enforcement. Instead of sending threatening letters and imposing immediate fines, they implemented a graduated system with warnings, opportunities to cure violations, and clear appeals processes. They also created a homeowner advisory committee to provide input on major decisions. Property values in Sunrise Ridge actually increased over the following year, despite the previous board's insistence that strict enforcement was necessary to maintain values. Turns out that creating a community where homeowners felt respected and supported was better for property values than ruling through fear and intimidation. As for me, my life returned to normal. My satellite dish remained firmly attached to my roof, providing excellent service. I framed the FCC's enforcement order and hung it in my home office as a reminder that standing up to bullies, even institutional ones, was worth the effort. I became something of a folk hero in Sunrise Ridge, which was both amusing and slightly embarrassing. Neighbors would stop me during walks to thank me for standing up to the old board. One couple even named their dog after me, which I found hilarious. Frank and I became good friends. We started a weekly tradition of having coffee on Saturday mornings and discussing community issues. He had a wealth of knowledge about how HOAs functioned and the history of governance in our neighborhood. "You know what the real lesson is here?" Frank said one morning about 6 months after everything had settled down. "It is that institutions are only as good as the people running them. HOAs serve an important purpose, maintaining common areas, organizing community activities, preserving certain standards. But when small-minded people get control, they turn those tools into weapons. The system needs better checks and balances," I agreed. "Homeowners need to be more engaged and willing to hold boards accountable." Exactly. Most people ignore HOA elections and meetings until something personally affects them. If they paid attention from the start, people like Brenda would never get power in the first place. He was right. After my experience, I made a point to attend every HOA meeting and stay informed about board decisions. So did many other homeowners who had been awakened by the controversy. The increased engagement kept the new board honest and responsive. About a year after the satellite dish incident, I got a call from Patricia Huang. She had been contacted by a legal publication that wanted to write about my case as an example of successful homeowner advocacy against HOA overreach. "Would you be willing to be interviewed?" she asked. "They are not using names publicly unless you approve, but they want to document the case for other attorneys and homeowners who might face similar situations." "Absolutely," I said. "If my experience can help others, I am happy to share it." The article was published in a journal focused on property law and homeowner rights. It detailed the entire saga from initial installation through FCC enforcement and settlement. Patricia told me she had already received inquiries from 3 other homeowners facing similar HOA disputes who wanted her representation. "You started something," she said. "Homeowners are realizing they do not have to just accept whatever their HOA demands. They have rights, and those rights are enforceable." The FCC also used my case as a teaching example. They published a fact sheet specifically for homeowners and HOAs explaining the over-the-air reception devices rule, citing my case as an example of what not to do. The fact sheet was distributed through real estate associations and HOA management companies throughout the country. I sometimes wondered what happened to Brenda. I heard through neighborhood gossip that she and her husband had moved to a different community in Scottsdale. Part of me hoped she had learned something from the experience, though I suspected people like that rarely changed their fundamental nature. The special assessment to pay for the FCC fine remained a sore point for many homeowners. $400 might not sound like much, but for some families it was a significant unexpected expense. The new board worked hard to rebuild trust by being extremely transparent about finances and cutting unnecessary expenses that the previous board had incurred. One interesting side effect of the entire controversy was that several other homeowners in Sunrise Ridge who had been considering satellite dishes suddenly felt empowered to install them. Within 6 months of my case settling, 8 more households had dishes installed. The new HOA board processed each application quickly and professionally, approving all of them since they met reasonable safety and installation standards. The neighborhood actually looked better with multiple dishes visible. It showed that real people lived in these homes, people with different needs and preferences. The previous board's obsession with creating a uniform aesthetic had made the community feel sterile and unwelcoming. My work life improved significantly once I had reliable internet again. I had been promoted at my software engineering job, partly because I had been able to return to my normal productivity levels. My boss had been understanding about the internet issues during the dispute, but having consistent connectivity made a huge difference in my ability to participate in video meetings and access company resources. I also started dating someone I met through all the community meetings. Her name was Olivia Sanders, and she lived 3 streets over. She had been one of the homeowners fined by Brenda's board for having decorative solar lights in her front yard that were supposedly not on the approved fixtures list. We bonded over our shared experiences dealing with HOA insanity, and our friendship gradually developed into something more. Olivia was an architect, which made her particularly irritated by the previous board's arbitrary aesthetic rules that had no basis in actual design principles. She ended up joining the Homeowner Advisory Committee and providing valuable input on updating community design guidelines to be more reasonable and flexible. "You know what is funny?" she said one evening as we were having dinner. "Brenda thought she was protecting property values by being so strict, but home sales have actually increased since the new board took over. People want to live in a community that treats them like adults, not subjects." She was right. I had looked at the real estate data out of curiosity. Home sales in Sunrise Ridge had increased by 23% compared to the previous year, and average prices were up. Real estate agents were apparently marketing the neighborhood's reformed governance as a selling point. The repairs to my roof held up perfectly. I had hired a highly rated roofing company to do the work, knowing that the HOA was paying for it. They had done an excellent job, and I had no issues with leaks or damage even during the monsoon season when Phoenix got its heaviest rains. My relationship with my satellite provider also evolved. They were so impressed with how I had documented everything and pursued enforcement that they asked if I would be willing to speak at a company meeting about customer advocacy. I agreed, and ended up giving a presentation to their legal and customer service teams about the importance of supporting customers when HOAs created problems. As a thank you, the company upgraded my service package for free for 2 years. They also used my case in training materials for their installation technicians, teaching them what to tell customers about their rights regarding protected installations. About 18 months after the dish was ripped off my roof, I received an unexpected letter. It was from a homeowner in Texas who had read about my case and was facing a similar situation. His HOA was threatening to remove his satellite dish, and he wanted advice on how to proceed. I spent an hour on the phone with him. walking through everything I had learned. I explained the FCC regulations, the importance of documentation, and the value of getting an attorney involved early. I also sent him copies of all the relevant FCC materials and connected him with Patricia, who was happy to refer him to a qualified attorney in Texas. That homeowner successfully fought his HOA and ended up with a similar settlement to mine. He sent me a thank you note and a gift card, which was unnecessary but appreciated. It felt good to know that my experience had directly helped someone else. I heard from 2 more homeowners over the following months, both facing satellite dish disputes with their HOAs. In each case, I provided information and guidance. Both of them resolved their situations successfully. One through settlement and one because the HOA backed down immediately once they cited FCC regulations and mentioned they knew about my case. It occurred to me that there was a broader need for this kind of information and support. Working with Patricia, I created a detailed guide for homeowners facing HOA disputes over satellite dishes. We published it online for free, covering everything from initial installation rights to documentation tips to enforcement options. The guide included links to relevant FCC regulations, sample letters, and a checklist for gathering evidence. The guide got picked up by several homeowner advocacy websites and was shared widely on social media. I started getting thank you emails from people all over the country who had used it to resolve their own disputes. Some never even had to hire an attorney, just citing the regulations and showing they knew their rights was enough to make their HOAs back down. This ripple effect was the most satisfying part of the entire experience. What had started as a violation of my rights had turned into something that helped countless other homeowners. Brenda had probably thought she was just enforcing rules on one annoying resident. Instead, she had sparked a movement. The Sunrise Ridge community continued to thrive under its reformed governance. The new board was transparent, responsive, and actually focused on improving the community rather than just enforcing arbitrary rules. They organized neighborhood events, improved common area maintenance, and created a community garden that became a popular gathering spot. Frank served 2 terms on the board before stepping down, satisfied that the community was on a good path. He told me that serving on the board after the Brenda disaster was one of the most rewarding experiences of his retirement. He felt like he had helped heal the neighborhood and restore trust in the HOA as an institution. Not all HOAs are bad, he said, just like not all governments or corporations or organizations are bad. It comes down to the people and the systems they create. When you have good people operating under transparent, fair systems, HOAs can actually enhance communities. When you have petty tyrants with unchecked power, you get what we had. I could not argue with that assessment. 2 years after the incident, I was contacted by a television producer who wanted to include my story in a series about homeowner rights. I was hesitant at first. I had never sought publicity and was not particularly interested in being on television. But the producer explained that they wanted to educate homeowners about their rights and showcase examples of successful advocacy. I agreed to participate on the condition that they also interviewed Patricia and included information about how homeowners could protect themselves. The segment aired a few months later as part of a consumer protection series. It was about 8 minutes long and covered the basics of my story, the FCC regulations, and practical tips for homeowners. The response was overwhelming. The television network received hundreds of emails and calls from homeowners dealing with similar issues. Patricia got so many inquiries that she had to hire an additional attorney to help handle HOA dispute cases. Several other lawyers around the country contacted her to learn more about using FCC regulations in HOA disputes. I had inadvertently become the poster child for homeowner rights against HOA overreach. It was strange and a bit uncomfortable at times, but also deeply satisfying. If my willingness to fight back had helped change the landscape even a little bit, then all the stress and expense had been worth it. Olivia and I got engaged about 2 years after we met. We decided to stay in my house in Sunrise Ridge rather than moving. We both loved the community, especially after the improvements under the new governance. We even got involved in organizing community events, including an annual summer barbecue that became a neighborhood tradition. My satellite dish remained on my roof, faithfully providing service year after year. Every time I looked up at it, I remembered the journey it had sparked. What could have been a moment of defeat, watching my property being destroyed while I stood helplessly in my yard, had instead become a catalyst for positive change. I learned several important lessons from the experience. First, documentation is everything. If I had not kept meticulous records of my HOA application, correspondence, and the destruction itself, my case would have been much harder to prove. Second, knowing your rights matters. Many people would have just accepted the HOA's actions because they did not know that federal law protected them. Third, standing up to bullies and abusive institutions is difficult but necessary. If everyone just accepts overreach, it only gets worse. The final lesson was about community. Throughout the ordeal, I was supported by neighbors, professionals, and even strangers who believed in the principle of homeowner rights. That network of support made the difference between giving up and seeing the fight through to the end. The HOA landscape in Arizona began changing in the years following my case. Several state legislators, prompted by increasing complaints about HOA overreach, introduced bills to reform HOA governance. While not all of the proposed legislation passed, some important changes were made. HOAs now face stricter requirements for financial transparency, and homeowners were given clearer appeals processes for challenging fines and violations. My case was cited in several legislative hearings as an example of why reform was needed. I even testified before a state committee about my experience. It was nerve-wracking speaking in front of legislators, but I felt it was important to ensure that other homeowners would not have to go through what I had endured. Patricia told me that inquiries about HOA disputes had increased dramatically across the legal community. Attorneys who had never handled these types of cases before were suddenly getting calls from homeowners who knew their rights and were willing to fight. The power dynamic was shifting. I also heard through the grapevine that HOA management companies were now providing training to board members about federal regulations and homeowner rights. Several management companies had been sued in the aftermath of cases similar to mine, and they were taking steps to avoid future liability. My case was apparently used as a cautionary tale in those training sessions. This is what happens when you do not respect homeowner rights. The irony was not lost on me. Brenda's attempt to assert dominance and control had backfired spectacularly, leading to changes that made it harder for HOAs to abuse their power. She had inadvertently become the catalyst for the very thing she probably would have opposed. 3 years after the satellite dish was torn from my roof, I had a chance encounter with Brenda. I was at a home improvement store in Scottsdale picking up supplies for a project when I saw her in the paint aisle. We made eye contact, and for a moment I thought she might pretend not to recognize me, but instead she walked over. "Hello, Daniel," she said stiffly. "Brenda," I acknowledged neutrally. There was an awkward silence. She looked older, more tired than I remembered. Finally, she spoke. "I want you to know that I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing for the community. I was not trying to hurt you personally." I considered her words carefully before responding. "I believe you thought you were doing the right thing. But intent does not excuse impact. You violated my rights and cost the community tens of thousands of dollars because you refused to acknowledge that you might be wrong." She flinched slightly. "I made mistakes. I have had a lot of time to think about it." "Did you learn anything?" I asked, genuinely curious. She was quiet for a long moment. "I learned that power, even small power like running an HOA board, can corrupt your judgment. I started to see every issue as a personal challenge to my authority rather than a problem to be solved. I became the thing I never wanted to be, someone who cared more about being right than doing right." It was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever said to me. I felt my anger, which had long since cooled, dissipate completely. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I hope you have found peace." She nodded slowly. "I hope your satellite dish continues working well," she said with a slight sad smile, and then she walked away. I never saw her again. That encounter gave me closure I had not realized I needed. For all the legal victories and policy changes, there had always been a human element that remained unresolved. Knowing that Brenda had at least attempted to understand what had gone wrong made me feel like the story was truly complete. Life continued in Sunrise Ridge. Olivia and I got married in a ceremony held in the community clubhouse, with half the neighborhood in attendance. Frank officiated, having gotten certified as a minister for the occasion. It was a perfect day, surrounded by a community that had come together through adversity and emerged stronger. My satellite dish remained on my roof, a small piece of technology that had sparked a much larger story. Every time I saw it, I thought about the journey from that awful morning when I heard footsteps on my roof, through the fights with the HOA and the FCC investigation, to the reforms and changes that followed. I thought about all the homeowners who had reached out, who had successfully fought their own battles because they knew their rights. I thought about the attorneys who now specialized in these cases, protecting homeowners from institutional overreach. I thought about the legislators who had passed reforms to prevent future abuses: one satellite dish, one stubborn homeowner, one abusive HOA board. It seemed like such a small, local issue, but it had rippled outward in ways I never could have imagined. The final chapter came 4 years after the original incident. The FCC updated its regulations and guidance regarding the over-the-air reception devices rule, making the protections even stronger and the penalties for violations more severe. The update specifically referenced several enforcement actions, including mine, as examples of the types of violations that would face serious sanctions. Patricia sent me a copy of the updated regulations with a note. "You helped change federal policy. Not bad for a software engineer from Phoenix." She was right. What had started as a personal violation had contributed to systemic change. That was the real victory, not the settlement money or the satisfaction of seeing Brenda's board removed, but knowing that the system had improved because I had refused to be a victim. I kept working remotely from my home office, my satellite internet humming along reliably. I kept attending HOA meetings, staying engaged in community governance. Olivia and I started talking about starting a family, maybe adding some kids to the diverse, thriving neighborhood we called home. And my satellite dish stayed exactly where it belonged, securely mounted on my roof, protected by federal law, and serving as a silent reminder that individual rights matter, that standing up to power is possible, and that one person's refusal to accept injustice can change things for everyone. The story could have ended badly. I could have given up, accepted the destruction of my property, and moved on. The HOA could have gotten away with their overreach, emboldening them to abuse more homeowners. But because I fought back, because I knew my rights and had the resources to pursue justice, everything turned out differently. That is the lesson I hoped others would take from my experience. When institutions overreach, when people in power abuse that power, individual citizens have tools to fight back. Those tools, the law, the courts, regulatory agencies, community organizing, only work when people are willing to use them. My satellite dish was not just about television and internet. It became a symbol of the broader principle that homeowners have rights that must be respected, that HOAs are not above the law, and that ordinary people can win against institutions when they refuse to be intimidated. 4 years, multiple legal actions, one federal fine, countless policy changes, and a completely transformed community, all because someone ripped a satellite dish off my roof, and I decided that was not okay. I won, the community won, homeowners across the country won, and my satellite dish, reinstalled and protected, continued beaming signals down from space, connecting me to the world beyond my roof, a roof that was now thoroughly protected by federal law, documented decisions, and the hard-won knowledge that rights mean nothing if you are not willing to defend them.